A father and his young daughter vanish from a park in 1970 during the construction of a nearby highway. 25 years later, their remains are unearthed in the same park, reigniting the cold case and casting a long shadow of suspicion on the secrets potentially buried with the controversial road project. The autumn of 1970 in the burgeoning lumber town of Oak Haven, Washington, carried the crisp, invigorating scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the faint, distant tang of saltwater from the Puget Sound. It was a familiar, comforting olfactory tapestry to its hardy, pragmatic residents, a signal of changing seasons and the cyclical rhythms of life in the Pacific Northwest. For Arthur Penhaligon, a thoughtful, sometimes stubbornly inquisitive 32-year-old journalist for the local independently owned Oak Haven Chronicle, and his bright, effervescent 6-year-old daughter Lily, a Saturday afternoon spent exploring the verdant, rambling expanse of Whispering Pines Community Park was a cherished, inviolable ritual. Arthur, a man whose mind was perpetually sifting through local happenings for potential stories, would often bring his worn, dog-eared notepad and a couple of freshly sharpened pencils, ostensibly to jot down observations or nascent story ideas. But mostly, his dark, observant eyes, often crinkled at the corners with a gentle amusement, would follow Lily's small, energetic form as she chased after elusive, brightly colored butterflies through the dappled, shifting sunlight that filtered through the dense canopy of the towering pines, firs, and cedars that gave the park its evocative name. Her joyous, unrestrained laughter would echo, clear and bright, amongst the ancient, moss-covered tree trunks, a sound that, for Arthur, encapsulated all the simple, profound beauty of his world. On this particular Saturday, October 17th, the air was noticeably cool, carrying the first real bite of impending winter, though the sky above was a brilliant, almost painfully intense, cloudless blue. Lily, her fine blonde pigtails, a shade lighter than her mother's, bouncing with unrestrained enthusiasm, was fiercely determined to find and capture, and then, as always, gently release, the king of butterflies, a mythical, grandly winged creature of her own vivid imagination. Arthur, leaning his lanky frame against the rough, comforting bark of an ancient, sprawling oak at the edge of a sunlit meadow, made sporadic notes about the increasingly controversial Western Gateway Freeway construction. The ambitious, state-funded project, designed to create a vital bypass around Oak Haven's progressively congested historic downtown district, was already a colossal, jarring behemoth of raw, churned earth, gleaming steel girders, and mountains of displaced rock. Its northern edge, a stark, aggressive scar of red clay and felled trees, was visibly carving its relentless path along the far perimeter of Whispering Pines Park, encroaching ever closer to the park's designated wilderness areas. The constant monotonous thrum of distant bulldozers, the high-pitched whine of power saws, and the percussive metallic clang of steel on rock had become an unwelcome, intrusive new soundtrack to the park's usually serene, natural tranquility, a source of much local grumbling and several heated town council meetings which Arthur himself had covered for the Chronicle. He had, in fact, been subtly investigating rumors of irregularities in the land surveying and acquisition process for the freeway, a line of inquiry that had ruffled a few influential feathers. They were last definitively seen around 3 p.m. by Mrs. Agnes Albright, a keen local bird watcher and a familiar figure in the park, her binoculars a permanent fixture around her neck. She later told police she saw Arthur patiently pushing Lily on the park's old, slightly creaky swing set, Lily's delighted, high-pitched squeals momentarily drowning out the distant, incessant construction noise. Mrs. Albright recalled, with a clarity that would later be minutely dissected by investigators, that Arthur had seemed slightly preoccupied that afternoon, his gaze often drifting, with a thoughtful, almost troubled expression, towards the churned, raw earth and the skeletal steel framework of a new freeway overpass taking ominous shape just beyond the park's northernmost tree line. He had waved a friendly, if somewhat distracted, greeting to her. When Arthur and Lily failed to return to their small, cozy clapboard house on Chestnut Street by dusk, a time when the comforting aroma of Eleanor Penhaligon's Saturday roast chicken usually filled their home. Eleanor, Arthur's wife and Lily's devoted mother, felt the first, cold, insidious tendril of unease snake around her heart. Arthur, for all his journalistic quirks and occasional bouts of intense preoccupation, was meticulously, almost obsessively punctual, especially where Lily's routines were concerned. As the familiar, comforting twilight deepened into a starless, unervingly silent night, her unease blossomed with terrifying speed into full-blown, sickening panic. Frantic, increasingly desperate calls to Arthur's parents, his few close friends, and the homes of Lily's little school friends yielded nothing but bewildered negatives and escalating concern. By midnight, a small, worried, rain-soaked group, including a pale but determined Eleanor, her brother, and a handful of local police officers roused from their Saturday night routines, were grimly, methodically combing through the darkened, silent, labyrinthine expanse of Whispering Pines Park. Their heavy-duty flashlight beams cut sharp, anxious, dancing swaths through the ancient, indifferent trees, illuminating familiar paths that now seemed menacing and alien. Of Arthur and Lily Penhaligon, there was absolutely no trace. Only a small, discarded, rain-sodden hair ribbon, Lily's absolute favorite, a cheerful bright blue with tiny white polka dots, found lying forlornly near the base of the old swing set, and the ever-present, unsettling, mechanical roar of the Western Gateway Freeway construction continuing its relentless, indifferent work under harsh, glaring floodlights just a few hundred yards away across the newly scarred earth. The initial days were a blur of organized searches, an outpouring of community support that saw hundreds of Oak Haven residents joining police and fire departments in grid searches that covered every inch of Whispering Pines and the surrounding forests. Eleanor, hollow-eyed and running on raw adrenaline, was a constant presence at the makeshift command post set up in the park's small community center, her face a mask of desperate hope that eroded with each fruitless day. Arthur's colleagues at the Oak Haven Chronicle ran front-page pleas for information, his editor using every contact he had to keep the story in the regional news. But the park and the sprawling, chaotic construction site beside it yielded no further clues, no witnesses to anything beyond Arthur and Lily's happy play. The initial, intensive police investigation into the perplexing and heartbreaking disappearance of Arthur and Lily Penhaligon was a whirlwind of activity that, despite its thoroughness and the unwavering dedication of Oak Haven's small police force, ultimately, agonizingly, proved fruitless. The town of Oak Haven, a community typically insulated from such stark, inexplicable tragedies, was shaken to its very core, its comforting veneer of small-town safety irrevocably fractured. Search parties, initially comprised of scores of police officers, highly trained volunteer firefighters, and hundreds of concerned, determined residents, meticulously, almost desperately, scoured every inch of Whispering Pines Community Park and the surrounding dense, often challenging woodlands for weeks that stretched into a bleak, rain-soaked November. Divers, braving the icy, murky waters, explored the shallow, reed-choked depths of Miller's Pond, a small, picturesque body of water nestled within the park's boundaries, their powerful searchlights piercing the opaque water, finding only discarded bottles and tangled fishing line. The official investigation, by necessity, extended its focus to the sprawling, chaotic, almost anarchic site of the Western Gateway Freeway construction, a vast, ever-changing landscape of raw earth, heavy machinery, and transient workers. Every foreman, every surveyor, every grimy, overall-clad construction worker who had been on site during the critical period was, at least in theory, interviewed. Their often vague time cards and even vaguer alibis meticulously checked and cross-referenced. The freshly turned earth, the deep, often dangerously unsecured excavation pits, the towering stacks of massive, echoing concrete pipes, all were scrutinized with a growing sense of desperation, But the sheer, overwhelming scale of the massive, federally funded project and the constant, daily reshaping of the terrain by monstrous earth-moving equipment made a truly thorough, exhaustive search almost logistically, physically impossible. Some investigators, and many local residents, whispered that the Penhulligans might have, tragically, innocently stumbled into a poorly secured, unlit area of the sprawling construction site after dark, perhaps disoriented by the unfamiliar landscape and fallen into an excavation pit. Their disappearance a terrible, unforeseen accident, their bodies quickly, unknowingly, swallowed by the relentless, unforgiving pace of progress. Others, particularly Eleanor and Arthur's colleagues at the Chronicle, harbored darker, more sinister fears. Fueled by Arthur's established reputation as a tenacious, principled journalist who wasn't afraid to ask deeply uncomfortable, often unwelcome questions, particularly about the freeway project's rapidly escalating costs, its significant environmental impact, and the persistent, shadowy rumors of questionable land acquisition tactics and backroom deals involving influential local figures. Had Arthur, in his quiet, methodical way, stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see, something that threatened powerful interests? Had he been deliberately silenced, and his innocent daughter, Lily, tragically, monstrously caught in the crossfire? As months bled into a year, then 2, then 5, the agonizing case of the missing Penhulligans grew progressively, inexorably cold. The Western Gateway Freeway was completed, a wide, impersonal, multi-lane ribbon of gray concrete and speeding, indifferent traffic that now permanently, irrevocably defined Oak Haven's northern boundary. Its constant, dull, pervasive roar, a persistent auditory intrusion that permeated even the once tranquil, secluded heart of Whispering Pines Park. The park itself underwent subtle, almost imperceptible, yet significant changes over the passing years. The section closest to the thundering freeway became somewhat neglected, its once popular picnic tables falling into disrepair, its winding woodland paths becoming overgrown and indistinct, its unique, cherished atmosphere of peaceful sanctuary subtly, undeniably altered, tainted by the freeway's intrusive, unceasing presence and the lingering, unspoken shadow of the unsolved disappearance. Eleanor Penhulligan, her life irrevocably, cruelly shattered by the loss of her husband and child, became a familiar, sorrowful, almost spectral figure in Oak Haven. She never sold their small house on Chestnut Street, keeping Lily's room exactly as it had been on that fateful October afternoon, a heartbreaking, dust-covered shrine to a lost childhood. She never truly gave up hope, not entirely. She organized yearly candlelight vigils on the anniversary of their disappearance, small, dwindling gatherings of faithful friends and a few sympathetic strangers. She periodically, persistently petitioned the Oak Haven Police Department and a succession of weary town mayors for renewed police interest in the case, her voice a quiet but unyielding testament to a mother's enduring love and a wife's unending grief. But with absolutely no new leads, no credible sightings from distant states, no anonymous tips, and certainly no ransom demands, the official police investigation inevitably, officially dwindled to nothing. The thick, voluminous case file eventually, reluctantly relegated to the dusty, overflowing archives of Oak Haven's unsolved cold cases. The town of Oak Haven, as towns inevitably must, moved on. The sharp, immediate memory of the vanished father and daughter slowly, gradually morphing over the passing decades from an active, raw wound into a poignant, almost mythical local legend. A cautionary tale whispered by parents to their children about the dangers of wandering too far into the woods, and a somber, chilling reminder of the deep, dark secrets that the unyielding earth can sometimes hold. For 25 long, agonizing, hope-starved years, Eleanor Penhulligan lived in a torturous, almost unbearable limbo, suspended precariously, eternally, between a desperate, flickering, almost extinguished hope for their miraculous return, and a soul-crushing, bone-deep despair that threatened daily to consume her entirely. Her hair turned from its youthful brown to a soft, snowy white, but the image of Lily's blonde pigtails and Arthur's thoughtful smile remained as vivid, as painfully immediate, as if they had vanished only yesterday. In the unexpectedly mild spring of 1995, a full quarter of a century after Arthur and Lily Penhaligon had vanished into the crisp autumn afternoon, the Oakhaven Town Council, spurred by a new wave of civic pride and a recently secured state grant for community improvement, finally approved a long-overdue, comprehensive Whispering Pines Park revitalization project. The ambitious plan, discussed and debated for years, included upgrading the outdated, somewhat dilapidated playground equipment, refurbishing the weathered picnic areas with new tables and grills, replanting native flora to combat invasive species, and, crucially for the unfolding of past secrets, laying a network of new underground irrigation pipes to service the park's increasingly parched and neglected northern section, the very area that directly bordered the now long-established, ceaselessly thrumming Western Gateway Freeway. This section of the park, ironically, had become even more isolated and overgrown since the freeway's completion, the constant noise and visual blight discouraging visitors. On a cool, overcast morning in late April, the kind of day where the gray sky seemed to press down heavily on the lush, rain-soaked Pacific Northwest landscape, a small team of municipal workers, clad in bright orange vests, began the noisy, earth-moving work of excavating a long, shallow trench for the new irrigation system. They were working near a particularly dense, almost impenetrable thicket of wild rhododendrons and tangled salal bushes, an area that, due to its proximity to the freeway's steep concrete retaining wall and its general inaccessibility, had remained largely untouched and undisturbed for decades, a forgotten pocket of wilderness within the managed park. Around mid-morning, as the sun struggled to break through the persistent cloud cover, the monotonous, rhythmic chug and scrape of the small backhoe being used for the trenching was abruptly, jarringly silenced. The operator, a young, sandy-haired man named Kevin Lattimore, a recent Oakhaven High graduate working a summer job with the town, stared down with a puzzled frown into the freshly dug, damp earth of the trench. He'd unearthed something that clearly wasn't soil, or rock, or even the gnarled root of an ancient tree. It was something different, something disturbingly out of place. Carefully, with a growing sense of unease that communicated itself wordlessly to his nearby foreman, Kevin and his older colleague, a grizzled, taciturn man named Gus, began to clear away the clinging, damp earth with their gloved hands. First, a fragment of oddly preserved, rotted fabric, its original color indeterminate. Then, unmistakably, chillingly, human bones. Small, delicate ones, and larger, more robust ones, tangled together in the dark, rich soil. The gruesome discovery sent an immediate, powerful shockwave through Oakhaven, instantly, violently resurrecting the ghost of its most enduring, painful, and unsolved mystery. The park was immediately, almost frantically, cordoned off by local police. The cheerful orange vests of the municipal workers replaced by the grim, somber blue of law enforcement. Forensic anthropologists from the State University were quickly summoned to the scene, their specialized skills essential in the delicate, painstaking task of exhuming and analyzing the fragile, long-buried remains. Within days, the grim, heartbreaking, yet somehow long-expected news was officially confirmed through a painstaking comparison of dental records, which Eleanor Penhaligon had religiously, hopefully, provided to the police every few years, and old, faded medical x-rays retrieved from dusty hospital archives. The skeletal remains unearthed from the shallow grave in Whispering Pines Park were, beyond any shadow of a doubt, those of Arthur Penhaligon and his beloved 6-year-old daughter, Lily. They had been found buried together, intertwined, less than 4 feet deep, in what appeared to be a hastily, crudely dug grave, not 50 yards from the old, rusted swing set where Lily had last been seen laughing and playing, and perilously, tellingly close to the original, disputed 1970 boundary of the massive Western Gateway Freeway construction zone. For Eleanor Penhaligon, now a woman in her late 50s, her once youthful face etched with the deep, indelible lines of a quarter-century of unresolved grief, profound loneliness, and the unyielding torment of uncertainty. The news was a devastating, almost unbearable paradox. It was an agonizing, final end to her desperate, flickering, 25-year-long hope for their miraculous return, yet also, in a strange, sorrowful, almost incomprehensible way, a profound, almost physical release from the daily, soul-crushing torture of not knowing. They were found. They were, in some small, tragic measure, home. But the very nature of their discovery, their clandestine burial so close to where their vibrant lives had seemingly just evaporated, ripped open old, deep wounds and screamed 1,000 new, terrifying, urgent questions. How had they died? What horrors had they faced in their final moments? And who, what kind of monster, had so cruelly, so callously buried them there, like discarded refuse, so close to where their laughter had once echoed, and then walked away, leaving them to the silence of the earth for a quarter of a century? The reopened, now officially designated homicide cold case landed with a heavy thud on the cluttered desk of Detective Frank Morrison, a veteran, world-weary Oakhaven police officer. Morrison, now graying at the temples, but still possessing the keen, analytical mind that had defined his long career, had been a raw, fresh-faced rookie cop in 1970. He vaguely, yet with a surprising clarity, remembered the initial, frantic, rain-soaked search for the missing Penhaligons, the palpable sense of fear and helplessness that had gripped the small town. He knew, with a grim certainty, that this would be a monumental, almost impossible task, sifting through decades of accumulated dust, faded, unreliable memories, the hardened, often self-serving silence of time, and the frustrating, inevitable degradation of any potential physical evidence. But looking at the faded, poignant photograph of Arthur and little Lily Penhaligon, their bright, innocent, hopeful faces staring out at him from a bygone, irretrievable era, Detective Morrison felt a renewed, grim, almost personal determination surge within him. Someone in Oakhaven, or someone who had passed through it 25 years ago, knew what had truly happened in Whispering Pines Park on that fateful October afternoon. And Frank Morrison, despite the overwhelming odds, was going to find them. Detective Frank Morrison began his daunting, almost archaeological task by immersing himself completely in the original 1970 case files for Arthur and Lily Penhaligon. The thick, brittle, yellowed folders, tied with faded string, were a somber, tangible archive of a community's initial, profound shock, and a police force's mounting, agonizing frustration. Stacks of handwritten witness statements on thin, carbon-copied paper, their ink faded but their words still conveying the urgency and fear of the time. Meticulously hand-drawn maps of search grids that had covered Whispering Pines Park and its environs. Roughly compiled lists of construction workers employed on the freeway project, many with only first names or vague, untraceable addresses. And countless, frustratingly brief notes detailing dead-end leads and fruitless inquiries. He noted with particular, growing interest the early, persistent, almost obsessive focus of the original investigators on the Western Gateway Freeway construction, and the almost insurmountable, repeatedly documented difficulties they had faced in trying to thoroughly, systematically search such a dynamic, constantly evolving, and vast industrial worksite. Reports detailed arguments with uncooperative foremen, concerns about site security, and the sheer impossibility of examining every load of excavated earth or every newly poured concrete support. Re-interviewing any surviving original witnesses or Oak Haven police officers from 1970 proved to be an exercise in both poignant reminiscence and profound frustration. Memories, after the passage of a quarter of a century, were notoriously, predictably unreliable, softened and reshaped by the relentless erosion of time, distorted by subsequent life events, or simply irretrievably erased from the aging human mind. Many of the key figures from the original investigation, including the lead detective at the time and several individuals who had been foremen or supervisors on the freeway construction project, were now deceased, their potential knowledge, their secrets, buried with them. Mrs. Agnes Albright, the birdwatcher who had provided the last confirmed sighting of Arthur and Lily, was now a frail, elderly woman residing in a local nursing home. Her memory of that specific, sunny October afternoon, however, remained surprisingly, heartbreakingly vivid. She tearfully, haltingly recounted her last glimpse of Arthur pushing Lily on the swings, Lily's delighted laughter, Arthur's preoccupied, distant gaze towards the construction zone. But she could offer no new details, no previously unremembered observation that might crack open the cold, hard shell of the decades-old case.
The primary, almost obsessive, unwavering focus of Detective Morrison's reopened investigation quickly, inevitably, became the 1970 Cedar Falls Highway Bypass Project, officially known back then as the Western Gateway Freeway. He painstakingly, almost forensically, began to reconstruct a detailed, day-by-day picture of the massive construction site as it had existed in and around October 1970. Who were the primary, state-contracted construction companies involved in that specific sector? Who were the individual foremen and supervisors directly in charge of the section of the freeway that bordered Whispering Pines Park, the area where the remains had been found? Were there any officially documented, or even informally rumored, safety concerns, serious accidents, unusual incidents, or whispers of illicit, clandestine activities, or deliberate, cost-cutting corner-cutting associated with that particular phase of the sprawling project? He spent laborious weeks, often late into the night, poring over archived, microfilmed Oak Haven municipal records, faded, brittle blueprints that cracked at the folds, and stacks of yellowed, fragile newspaper clippings from the Oak Haven Chronicle, some of which, with a heavy, poignant irony, had been meticulously researched and written by Arthur Penhalogan himself in the months, even weeks, leading up to his and Lily's disappearance. These articles, Morrison noted with a keen professional interest, had subtly, yet persistently, questioned the freeway project's significant, often downplayed, environmental impact, its controversial land acquisition tactics, which had displaced several long-term residents, and the opaque, sometimes questionable, allocation of its escalating budget. Arthur had been asking pointed questions. The inherent difficulties of investigating a 25-year-old potential crime were immense, almost overwhelming. Official construction company records from that era, particularly for state-contracted projects involving multiple subcontractors, were often poorly kept, inconsistently filed, incomplete, or, in many cases, had been long since legally destroyed or simply lost in the intervening decades. Tracing individual, often transient laborers from a quarter of a century prior, many of whom had likely moved on multiple times or were now deceased, was a near impossible, Herculean task. Yet Morrison, driven by a deep-seated sense of duty to Eleanor Penhalogan and the memory of the lost father and child, persisted with a quiet, stubborn tenacity. He managed, after weeks of inquiries and cross-referencing old union rosters, to locate a retired site engineer, a man named Bill Hoskins, now living in a small town in neighboring Idaho, who had worked as a junior surveyor on the freeway section immediately adjacent to Whispering Pines Park in the fall of 1970. Hoskins, initially wary and his memory clouded by time, eventually, over several long phone conversations, spoke of the often chaotic, high-pressure, sometimes dangerously lax atmosphere of the massive construction site. "It was a hell of a rush job, Detective," Hoskins admitted, his voice gravelly with age and perhaps, Morrison sensed, with old, unspoken anxieties.
Lots of pressure from the state, from the politicians, to get that damn freeway done on time, and more importantly, under its already ballooning budget. Safety? Well, let's just say it wasn't always priority number one, not when deadlines were looming. We had a ridiculously high turnover of casual labor back then, too. Some pretty rough, unsavory characters passed through that site, hired for a few weeks, then gone without a trace. He recalled vague, unconfirmed rumors of petty theft from the equipment sheds, frequent alcohol-fueled late-night poker games held in the site trailers, and even some hushed, fearful whispers about a particularly confrontational, widely disliked senior foreman, a burly, red-faced man named Vince Rourke, notorious for his explosive, unpredictable temper and for not suffering fools or, indeed, inquisitive, note-taking journalists gladly. Rourke, Hoskins believed, though he wasn't entirely certain, had died suddenly of a massive heart attack sometime in the late 1970s or early 1980s.
The detailed forensic report on the exhumed skeletal remains of Arthur and Lily Penhaligon, when it finally arrived on Morrison's desk, offered frustratingly few definitive, game-changing answers. Due to the 25 long years of decomposition in the acidic, damp Washington soil, the exact, unequivocal cause of death for both Arthur and Lily could not be conclusively, scientifically determined. There were no obvious, discernible signs of gunshot wounds or knife injuries on the fragile, discolored skeletal remains. However, the forensic anthropologists noted some subtle perimortem occurring at or near the time of death, fracturing on one of Arthur's ribs, and a slight, almost invisible depression on a section of his skull. Injuries that could have been consistent with blunt force trauma, but could also, they cautioned, have occurred post-mortem due to soil compression or even, however unlikely, during the initial, less careful phase of the backhoe excavation. Their positioning in the shallow, crudely dug grave, lying side by side, with Arthur's larger skeletal frame partially, almost protectively, shielding Lily's much smaller one, suggested they had been placed there together, perhaps even at the same time. There were no remnants of bindings, no scraps of foreign material, no obvious, glaring clues as to the identity of their killer or killers, nor any definitive indication of the precise manner of their deaths. Detective Morrison found himself exploring several grim, plausible theories. Could it, after all, have been a tragic, unforeseen accident? Had Arthur and Lily, perhaps taking a shortcut or exploring off the beaten path, wandered onto the dangerous, poorly secured construction site, maybe after dark, and fallen into an unmarked, unlit excavation pit or a deep trench for laying culverts? Could their bodies then have been either unknowingly or, more chillingly, deliberately and hastily covered over by construction workers, perhaps led by a foreman like Vince Rourke, desperate to avoid costly delays, official scrutiny, and the inevitable negative publicity an on-site fatality would bring to the already controversial project? This scenario, Morrison conceded, seemed tragically plausible, especially given the very close proximity of their makeshift grave to the original, disputed 1970 boundary of the freeway construction zone. Or was it something far more sinister, more deliberate? Had Arthur Penhaligon, in his capacity as a tenacious, investigative journalist, truly seen something he shouldn't have? Perhaps evidence of illegal dumping of hazardous materials, organized theft of valuable construction supplies, or even deeply corrupt practices involving land deals and contract allocations related to the freeway. Had he been brutally silenced to prevent exposure, and whose innocent daughter Lily, tragically, monstrously, killed with him simply because she was a witness? The shadowy, intimidating figure of Vince Rourke, the reportedly volatile and potentially ruthless foreman, loomed large and menacing in this deeply disturbing theory. But with Rourke almost certainly deceased, and any potential witnesses long since scattered or silenced by time, proving any direct criminal involvement on his part, or that of any other construction personnel, was an almost insurmountable, perhaps even impossible challenge. The damp, unforgiving earth beneath the Western Gateway Freeway and the silent, indifferent passage of 25 long years held their dark, impenetrable secrets with an unyielding, frustrating tenacity.
Detective Frank Morrison, despite his unwavering, methodical persistence and the renewed, albeit somber, public interest in the Penhaligon case, found himself increasingly ensnared in a frustrating, almost maddening web of time-eroded evidence, faded memories, and the impenetrable, unyielding silence of the deceased. The deep investigation into the massive Cedar Falls Highway Bypass project, specifically the chaotic construction phase of 1970, while yielding tantalizing, deeply unsettling whispers and troubling anecdotes like those provided by the retired site engineer Bill Hoskins, tales of the notoriously volatile foreman Vince Rourke, his rumored intimidation tactics, and the generally lax, almost reckless safety practices on site, ultimately failed to produce a single, solitary piece of concrete, actionable, prosecutable evidence that directly, unequivocally linked the construction activities or any of its specific personnel to the deaths of Arthur and Lily Penhaligon. Vince Rourke's patchy employment records, eventually unearthed from a dusty, forgotten archive in the state capitol, confirmed he was indeed the senior foreman on site during October 1970, and a few brief, heavily redacted internal memos hinted at disciplinary issues related to his aggressive management style. But with no living witnesses willing or able to directly implicate him or anyone else in a crime of such magnitude, and with absolutely no surviving physical evidence from the gravesite beyond the victims themselves that could tie them to a specific individual, the compelling theory of a construction-related murder or a criminally negligent accidental burial and subsequent cover-up remained just that: a strong, deeply plausible, but ultimately frustratingly unprovable suspicion. The official final cause of death for both Arthur and Lily Penhaligon remained, on the newly amended death certificates, as undetermined due to advanced decomposition and skeletalization, a frustratingly ambiguous, deeply unsatisfying medico-legal conclusion that offered no real solace, no true sense of closure to Eleanor Penhaligon. The lack of clear, definitive skeletal trauma made a violent, overt confrontation less certain, though it certainly could not be ruled out. Had they been suffocated, their soft tissues long since returned to the earth? Poisoned, the toxins untraceable after a quarter of a century? The unforgiving earth, their silent tomb for so long, had reclaimed those specific, terrible secrets too thoroughly, too completely. The manner of their burial, together, side by side in a shallow, unmarked, crudely dug grave, strongly suggested a hurried, clandestine, desperate act. Yet the subtle, poignant positioning of Arthur's larger skeletal frame, as if partially instinctively shielding Lily's much smaller one, more fragile one, hinted at a final, desperate paternal instinct in his last moments. Or, perhaps more chillingly, even a killer's fleeting, incongruous, almost paradoxical moment of rudimentary, almost reluctant respect. Or simply the pragmatic expediency of haste in a terrifying situation. For Eleanor Penhaligon, the discovery of their precious remains after 25 long, agonizing years of torturous uncertainty brought a strange, complex, bittersweet form of closure. The daily, soul-crushing agony of their unknown whereabouts, the relentless, cyclical torment of not knowing if they were alive or dead, suffering unimaginable horrors, or somehow, miraculously, at peace, was finally, blessedly over. She could now lay them to rest properly, with dignity, in the quiet, well-tended Oak Haven Cemetery, beside her own beloved parents, beneath a simple, elegant granite headstone that bore their names, their birth dates, and the simple, heartbreaking final inscription: Arthur and Lily Penhaligon, together in life, together in eternity. Lost October 17, 1970, found April 28, 1995. The town of Oak Haven, its collective conscience pricked, its old wound reopened, rallied around her with a quiet, profound sympathy.
The memorial service was a poignant, heavily attended affair, the small community church overflowing with people who remembered Arthur's thoughtful journalism, Lily's bright, infectious smile, or simply the enduring, haunting story of their disappearance. It finally allowed the community, as a whole, to collectively mourn the father and daughter whose sudden, inexplicable vanishing had haunted their collective memory for an entire generation. Yet the deeper, more fundamental questions — how exactly had they died? What terror had they faced in their final moments? And, most crucially, who was ultimately responsible for their deaths and their clandestine burial — remained stubbornly, painfully, infuriatingly unanswered, a persistent, aching, gaping void in the fabric of Eleanor's hard-won peace. Detective Frank Morrison, after many more months of pursuing every conceivable, increasingly tenuous lead, eventually, with profound reluctance and a heavy heart, had to officially suspend the active, resource-intensive phase of the reopened investigation, lacking sufficient new evidence to proceed with any arrests or formal, prosecutable accusations. The Western Gateway Freeway, now a vital, unremarkable, seamlessly integrated artery of regional commerce and transport, thundered on relentlessly, its thousands of daily passing vehicles and their occupants entirely oblivious to the profound human tragedy that might be literally, metaphorically, buried within its very foundations, or, at the very least, forever associated with its controversial, contentious construction. It stood, for those who knew the story, as a stark, unyielding, almost accusatory symbol of how progress, with its relentless, often ruthless forward momentum, can sometimes pave over, obscure, and effectively silence the past, burying inconvenient, uncomfortable truths, both literally and figuratively, beneath layers of concrete, asphalt, and the deliberate amnesia of time.
Eleanor Penhaligon lived out her remaining years in the small clapboard house on Chestnut Street, a woman indelibly marked by a profound, quiet, almost luminous sorrow, but also, remarkably, by a resilient, unyielding, enduring love for the husband and daughter so cruelly, so inexplicably stolen from her. She found a measure of quiet solace, a way to tangible connect with their memory, in meticulously tending a small, beautiful memorial garden she established and nurtured in a secluded corner of Whispering Pines Park, not far from the dense thicket of rhododendrons where their remains had been unearthed. It was filled with fragrant lilies, Arthur's favorite deep purple irises, and delicate, shade-loving ferns. The profound mystery of their deaths, while officially unsolved and archived away, never truly, completely faded from Oakhaven's collective memory. The Whispering Pines cold case became a somber, enduring local legend, a poignant, chilling reminder of the dark, often unfathomable secrets that can lie hidden just beneath the placid, ordinary surface of everyday life, and of the unyielding, eternal silence that some roads and some graves will steadfastly, stubbornly keep forever. Detective Frank Morrison, until his own retirement many years later, would occasionally, on quiet, reflective afternoons, pull out the thick, worn Penhaligon file from the cold case archives, staring at the faded, youthful faces of Arthur and Lily, forever 6 years old, always wondering, with a persistent, familiar ache of professional regret, if there was just one more stone he could have turned, one more forgotten, overlooked voice from that distant past that might, just might, have finally spoken the full, unvarnished truth. But the road, and the relentless, unforgiving passage of time, had irrevocably, tragically, claimed too much.